Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, it truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The General's Cat. It was a chilly evening when my friends and I decided to venture into the countryside in search of something old, something abandoned, and perhaps a little mysterious. We had heard rumors about an enormous mansion that once belonged to a decorated World War II general, said to have been deserted since the 1950s following his passing. With flashlights in hand and our sense of adventure tingling, we pulled off a gravel road around 6 o'clock p.m. and approached the towering structure, surrounded by dense forest and tall, whispering grass. The building looked like it had stepped out of another era, weather-worn and haunting, as if it had been waiting decades for someone to return. The iron gates creaked open with a reluctant groan, and the heavy wooden doors followed, releasing the scent of dust and time as we crossed the threshold into its hushed interior. Inside, the house seemed endless, like a dream unraveling one hallway at a time. With every creaky floorboard and every gust of wind echoing through the broken windows, it became clear that the mansion was far more than just a decaying shell. It was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms, spiral staircases, cracked mirrors, and wallpaper peeling like old skin. As we moved from one dimly lit chamber to the next, a soft meowing interrupted our silent awe. We turned to see a cat, elegant and composed, white with striking black patches, stepping calmly through a doorway we had just passed. He seemed impossibly clean and healthy for a creature supposedly surviving alone in this decayed estate. I recognized the signs immediately. I had volunteered at a homeless cat shelter for years and could tell this feline wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. The cat approached me without hesitation, rubbed against my leg, and let me stroke him like we'd known each other forever. His fur was pristine, his eyes bright, and his demeanor oddly calm, as if this eerie old mansion was his domain. What struck us all was the cat's utter lack of fear or skittishness. He followed us from room to room like a guardian or perhaps a guide, never meowing much, never getting in the way, simply padding along as we explored. It gave the house a strangely comforting presence, though the deeper we wandered, the more unusual everything began to feel. At times, it seemed like the house shifted behind us, as if new shadows crept in where none had been before. But no matter where we went, the cat was always nearby, watchful, silent, almost knowing. By the time we were ready to leave, night had wrapped the forest outside in darkness, and the wind howled low through the tall grass. As we prepared to go, I found myself deeply worried about the cat. The mansion was remote, desolate, and utterly devoid of human contact. How could such a pristine creature survive here? I couldn't bear to think of him being abandoned, left to slowly vanish in the dust like the rest of this forgotten place. I decided, quietly but firmly, that if I could catch him, I would take him with me and find him a safe, warm home, even if that meant keeping him myself. But when I looked around to call him, he was gone. A moment ago, he had been weaving between our legs, meowing softly. Now, he had vanished as if the walls had swallowed him. We searched every room we'd passed through, calling softly, checking under broken furniture and behind doors hanging from their hinges. Nothing. The small entrance room where we'd first spotted him was empty. I even stepped outside, hoping he might have slipped into the tall grass. Still nothing. Something felt wrong in the stillness. I returned inside and decided to check the one place we had all deliberately avoided, the basement. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended into the cool, damp dark. The smell of mildew was thick and the air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. And then There it was. Lying in the corner of the stone floor was the skeletal remains of a cat. Its fur was long gone, but its body size and shape looked disturbingly familiar. My heart dropped. I turned and rushed back upstairs, my breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. It couldn't be. The cat we'd seen had been real, solid, warm, purring under my hand. Yet that corpse downstairs had likely been there for decades. I told the others, and we all stood silently, thinking back to the gentle meows, the calm eyes, the perfectly clean coat. There had been no way that cat was alive, in any normal sense of the word. We left the house in silence, barely speaking as we walked back through the overgrown path and climbed into the car. The headlights flickered as we started the engine, and behind us, in one of the mansion's upper windows, I could have sworn I saw a shape. Small, poised, feline, watching us go. That night, none of us slept well. I couldn't stop thinking about the cat, about the way he'd led us through that old house, the way he vanished the moment I thought to take him away. I dreamed of long echoing halls and whispering meows in the dark. The next morning I tried to rationalize everything. Perhaps it was a different cat, maybe someone had brought him there recently, or maybe my mind had simply made a connection that wasn't really there. But even the most grounded of my friends admitted that something felt off, as if we'd been accompanied by more than just each other in that house. We returned weeks later, during the day, hoping to see him again, but the mansion was eerily still. No cat, no signs of recent life, only the same decaying walls and the ghost of something we couldn't explain. Later I did some research. The general who had owned the house had been known for his love of animals, particularly cats. He was often seen walking the grounds with one draped over his shoulder or curled in his lap while reading on the porch. When he died, the house was sealed, left untouched by his family due to disputes over the estate. No one officially lived there afterward. Neighbours, what few there were in that remote area, had reported seeing a cat watching from the windows in the years following, though no one ever found any animals when they entered. Some whispered it was the general's favourite companion, still keeping watch over the halls and rooms they once roamed together. I never told anyone outside our group what we saw that night, but I sometimes wonder if that cat really had been a ghost, a spirit bound by loyalty to its long-gone master. The memory has stayed with me all these years. Sometimes, when I pass an old building or see a cat lingering by a gate, I feel a tug at the edge of my thoughts, like something half-remembered trying to rise. I've had pets since then, loving, warm, wonderful companions, but none have ever moved with the same silence, the same confidence as the cat in that mansion. It's strange, the things we carry with us, the moments that press themselves into our minds and refuse to fade. I've walked through many abandoned places since, taken countless pictures, met other explorers, but that first time, with that mysterious feline figure, remains unlike anything else. It felt personal, like we were meant to be there, like the house was showing us its story through the eyes of its last true resident. If I could go back, I don't know if I would try to take the cat with me again. Maybe some things aren't meant to be removed from where they belong. Maybe the past clings to places, and sometimes it takes the form of something familiar, something comforting, to remind us that not all ghosts are there to scare. Some are just watching, waiting, remembering, and perhaps, in the deep quiet of certain forgotten places, they're hoping we'll remember them too, not with fear, but with a gentle kind of awe, like the purring presence of a cat in a house that time tried to forget. Story 2. The Camp Beyond the Forest. When I was a child, our home stood at the edge of a wide expanse of semi-rural countryside, nestled between patches of suburban neighbourhoods and open, unclaimed land. Our property stretched over 7 quiet acres, and behind the house, just beyond a fence that marked the boundary of our land, began a dense forest that extended far beyond the reach of our backyard. To me, it felt like the edge of the known world, a a green wall of mystery filled with endless possibilities. Hidden deep within those trees long before my family moved in, there had been a campground, abandoned and slowly dissolving back into the earth. Local law suggested it had once been a vibrant gathering spot, with cabins, a mess hall and even a pool, but its doors had closed abruptly, shrouded in rumours of drug use, accidents and unexplained disappearances. Though its exact history was never confirmed, the stories passed down through neighbours were enough to keep most people away. One evening, when I was about 7 years old, my mother was working a night shift and my father, adventurous and fearless, decided to take me and my slightly younger sister exploring. We had heard whispers about the old campground, and despite the unease that surrounded the tales, curiosity outweighed caution. It wasn't quite dark yet. The summer sky was still tinged with gold, but the forest already hummed with the sounds of the approaching night. We stepped off the familiar trail and into the woods, crossing the invisible line where the world we knew ended and the forgotten one began. As we moved deeper, the air thickened with a strange stillness. It wasn't long before we spotted the remains of the campground, hidden beneath creeping vines and broken branches. The cabins were still standing, though many were missing doors, and the once pristine pool had long since become a murky pond filled with algae and insects. Despite the overwhelming quiet and sense of abandonment, we explored with a sense of wonder. To a child, everything old was magical, and the decaying wood and rusting signs seemed to speak of adventures past. My father remained calm, watchful, as my sister and I peeked into the cabins, giggling over forgotten bunks and dusty fireplaces. But even then, something about the place felt strange. I remember how the wind seemed to blow in bursts, like whispered warnings, and how the trees creaked even without a breeze. There was no electricity, no signs of recent life, but an atmosphere clung to everything, a sense that the place wasn't entirely empty. As dusk deepened, we reached a cabin near the center of the campground and stepped inside, our feet quiet against the rotting floorboards. It was then that the mood shifted sharply. From outside we heard voices, low, urgent, and unmistakably human. Peeking out through a cracked window, we saw two men wandering among the trees, moving with a kind of frantic energy that set our nerves on edge. They didn't appear to be campers or hikers. Their clothes were worn, their expressions wary and aggressive, and they kept glancing over their shoulders, speaking in hushed tones, like they were either hiding something or searching for someone. My father's stance changed immediately. He stepped in front of the door, shielding my sister and me, and told me quietly to hold on to a loose brick I'd picked up earlier. The seriousness in his voice made my stomach twist. It wasn't just a game anymore. He didn't say we were in danger, but the way he looked at those men, and how they looked back, made everything feel suddenly fragile. One of the men turned and locked eyes with my father through the dusty glass. They stared at each other in silence for several seconds that felt like minutes, an unspoken understanding passing between them. I watched as my father subtly tensed, preparing for something I didn't yet understand. Then, as if deciding something, the man turned, whispered to his companion, and the two slowly disappeared into the woods, vanishing between the trees without a word. My father waited, eyes on the tree line, until he could no longer see or hear them. Then he turned to us and whispered that it was time to go. We didn't talk much as we made our way back through the campground, but every few moments he would glance behind us, alert and silent, like a man expecting to be followed. The shadows lengthened around us, and even though we were just minutes from home, it felt like the path stretched for miles. When we finally made it back to our house, the porch light shining like a beacon through the dark, there was a visible release of tension in my father's shoulders. He told us not to mention the men to Mum, and we nodded. We knew instinctively that this was something we were meant to forget. But I never did. Even as a child, I recognized the fear that had hovered in my father's eyes. Not just caution, but genuine fear. The kind that comes from sensing something deeply wrong. Years later, he admitted he had no idea who those men were, and that they certainly didn't have permission to be there. He confessed he'd felt something was off the moment he saw them, a gut feeling he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just their appearance. It was the way they moved, the way they spoke, and the way they watched us, like we were in their territory, not ours. We never went back to the campground. My father continued to hunt in the surrounding woods during deer season, but he avoided the trail that led to those decaying cabins. The years passed, and nature continued to reclaim the ruins, hiding what remained beneath a blanket of ivy and silence. Sometimes I'd hear friends mention it, always in whispers, always with stories that never quite lined up. People said they heard noises from the woods at night, strange lights moving among the trees, and even voices calling out in the dark. Some claimed to have seen figures standing still among the branches, watching. Whether those stories were rooted in truth or just born of local imagination, I'll never know. But what I do know is this: something about that place had changed the way I looked at the forest. It had gone from a playground to a boundary, from a place of wonder to one of quiet wariness. Even now, as an adult, I sometimes find myself driving past the edge of that forest. The land looks untouched, peaceful, just as it always did. But I feel the weight of memory in my chest. I think about that summer evening, the rustling leaves, the whisper of danger, and the way silence can speak louder than words. I wonder if that campground still stands, if the cabins still creak in the wind, if the pool still reflects the stars, if the men we saw ever returned. I've thought about returning as an adult, with better equipment and more understanding, but every time I consider it, something inside me says no, not yet, maybe not ever. Some places are better left to the trees, to the past, and to the stories that echo only when no one is listening. Perhaps what haunts me most isn't the fear or the unknown, but the way that experience marked a shift in how I understood the world. I had always believed that grown-ups were in control, that my parents could handle anything. But that day I saw something deeper, a vulnerability, a silent calculation of threat, and a decision made out of instinct to protect. My father never said it, but I know he was ready to fight if it had come to that, and I was ready too. Brick in hand, heart pounding, trying to be brave. It was the first time I realized that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just arrives, quietly, dressed like something normal, and waits for you to notice. That knowledge has followed me ever since, and maybe that's what makes abandoned places so compelling. They are the spaces where history and memory collide, where echoes of past lives linger, and where silence isn't empty but filled with unseen stories. That old campground may be forgotten by most, reclaimed by vines and time, but for me, it remains vivid, a moment frozen in dusk, in leaves, in the eyes of two strangers. It taught me to listen to the quiet, to trust my instincts, and to recognize that some mysteries are better left unexplored. Even now, when I walk past a tree line or hear a rustle in the underbrush, I remember that summer evening, that brick in my hand, and the heavy stillness of a forest that once whispered something I will never fully understand. Story 3. The rabbit hole at the river's edge. Back in our high school days, when life still felt like an open map waiting to be drawn upon, my friends and I discovered a strange sort of joy in urban exploration. We weren't looking for danger, not exactly. We simply longed for the unknown, the thrill of stepping beyond the polished surface of everyday life. Our hometown, a sleepy stretch of land near the Mississippi River, was full of hidden places if you knew where to look. One summer evening, a friend of a friend mentioned a secret beach, tucked past some train tracks and woods, just a short hike over a hill. Intrigued, we all piled into a car and headed out with nothing but flashlights, backpacks, and a restless curiosity. The beach was unlike anything we'd expected. Soft sand, weather-beaten logs forming makeshift benches, and a breathtaking view of the river stretching wide beneath a quiet dusk sky. It wasn't the beach that would stay with us. It was what lay beyond it. That night, beneath a canopy of stars, we built a small fire and listened to the river hum. The same friend who had shown us the beach told us there was something even more extraordinary just a little further into the woods. A ship graveyard. The name alone sparked every sense of adventure within us. We followed him along a narrow path overgrown with thistles and branches, eventually climbing a steep dirt hill where massive slabs of metal jutted from the ground like ancient bone. At the summit, the forest opened into a clearing of twisted metal and rusting giants. Old shipping containers, decayed hulls of forgotten boats, and remnants of industrial structures stood silently beneath the moonlight. Some were upturned, others half buried. At the center of it all was a squat, blocky building tagged in faded graffiti with the words, "The Rabbit Hole," and a cartoonish bunny smiling beside it. It felt surreal, like stumbling onto the aftermath of a lost civilization. We wandered the grounds, slowly, voices lowered by instinct more than intention. The air held a quiet weight, thick with dust and the scent of aged iron. None of us dared to open the shipping crates, though many of them sat partially ajar, their darkness spilling into the night like unspoken secrets. Graffiti covered everything. Names, symbols, strange messages. Time seemed to bend in that space. We stayed for maybe an hour, walking carefully between collapsed structures and skeletal beams before heading back to the beach, our steps crunching against gravel and metal. It would have remained just a hauntingly beautiful memory, a night of teenage wonder and the discovery of a place untouched by rules. But several months later, a tropical storm swept through the area. The landscape shifted, trails became blocked, and the beach itself bore scars from the violent weather. And when we returned after the storm, we found that something else had shifted too. Something more than trees and mudslides. Wanting to impress a girl I liked, I suggested we revisit the beach with a few friends. Many hadn't seen it, and the idea of a secret hangout spot sounded romantic. The journey there was messier than before. Fallen trees blocked parts of the old path, and we had to take a different, more tangled route through the woods. The hill leading to the graveyard had turned into a muddy slope, slick and unstable, but we pressed on. When we reached the ship graveyard, the damage was evident. Structures had been displaced, debris scattered everywhere, and yet, in the middle of the chaos, the rabbit hole remained, weathered but intact. We found several massive fire extinguishers and, being young and foolish, tested them. They worked, releasing clouds of white fog and loud hissing that echoed through the clearing. We laughed, the sound both reckless and uneasy, trying to shake the growing sense of disquiet. Someone, braver or simply more curious than the rest, climbed onto the roof of the rabbit hole building to get a better view. But instead of calling down about the landscape or the river, he quickly scrambled back down and whispered urgently to the group. "There was someone else there with us," he said. Hidden near the large metal structure adjacent to the upturned ship was a figure, tall, unmoving, and silently rocking back and forth. We froze, scanning the area with wide eyes. And then we saw it too. A blanket or tarp draped like a curtain from the side of the ship, swaying gently in the breeze. It was as if someone had made a home there, or a nest, or something worse. We hadn't noticed it on our approach, but now it was impossible to ignore. The figure hadn't moved since we spotted it, but its stillness was more terrifying than any sudden motion. It watched us, we could feel it. Panic set in like fog rolling in from the river. We turned to retreat the way we came, but the dirt hill was more treacherous now, soaked and loose beneath our feet. We scrambled, slipping and clawing at exposed roots and bent metal. Scrapes and bruises bloomed across our skin as we hauled ourselves upward, adrenaline dulling the pain. When we reached the top and looked back, the figure was gone. The blanket too had vanished from the side of the ship. There was nothing but stillness, silence, and the dreadful weight of being watched. We didn't speak until we were far from the graveyard, whispering to each other as we crossed the beach, past the logs, back over the tracks, and into the safety of the car. Only then did we let ourselves breathe again. The drive home was quiet, headlights cutting through the dark like knives through velvet. no one asked to go back. For weeks afterward, the memory haunted us. Who had been there? Why had they watched in silence? Were they squatting, hiding, or simply waiting? The possibilities churned in our minds, unsettling and unsatisfying, and perhaps what disturbed us most wasn't the figure itself, but the timing. The storm had cleared away so much, yet somehow left just enough for something or someone to take up residence. We had always thought the ship graveyard was ours, a forgotten place claimed by curiosity and youthful bravery, but that night taught us we had only ever been visitors. That place belonged to the shadows, to rust and roots and watchers without names. I still think of the rabbit hole sometimes, the strange little building with the smiling bunny, and wonder what might be inside it now, or what might be watching from the dark. None of us returned after that. The beach faded from conversation, the graveyard tucked into the folds of memory like an old photograph you no longer frame. The girl I had tried to impress drifted away, as did many things from that chapter of my life. But the experience remained, a strange scar of wonder and fear, of discovering that the world held more than what we saw, and that not all mysteries welcome explorers. There was beauty in that night, yes, but also a silence that followed us home. I sometimes wonder if the figure had been there the first time we visited, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Or perhaps it had come later, drawn by the storm, or by us. There's no way to know, and perhaps that's for the best. Urban exploration, for all its adventure, has a way of changing how you see the world. Abandoned places are not empty. They are full of echoes, of moments long gone, of people who left something behind, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unwillingly. The ship graveyard was no different. It was more than forgotten metal and graffiti. It was a place suspended in time, unclaimed by the present, shaped by those who once passed through it and those who still do. And if you ever find yourself near a riverbank, with the wind brushing against your skin and the trees rustling secrets you can't quite hear, listen closely. Look to the edges, and remember that not everything abandoned is lifeless, and not every silence is empty. Story 4. The Breath in the Attic. It was nearly 20 years ago, though the memory still feels strangely vivid, like a photograph that hasn't faded. There was an old house not far from a haunted hotel that had become something of a legend in our area, and one night a group of us decided to go exploring. It wasn't the first time we had ventured into an abandoned place, looking for signs of ghosts or remnants of the past. My best friend and I had been ghost hunting for a while and had gotten a reputation for it, which meant this time we were joined by a few others, some curious, some skeptical, all of them tagging along like tourists. We had been through similar buildings before, always careful not to damage anything, just pulling loose boards or using already broken entrances. We didn't want trouble. The house that night was quiet, still filled with leftover furniture and the smell of mildew, with droppings on the floor and the faint rustle of bats above. We agreed early on that we wouldn't go into the attic. That was where the bats came and went, and we didn't want to disturb them or whatever else might be up there. As we spread out, a couple of the newcomers got spooked and decided to head back to the cars, leaving just 3 of us inside. My buddy and I were upstairs, standing near the top of a wide staircase that looked down into the shadows, while a girl we had brought along, someone new to all this, remained on the first floor near the living room, just around the corner. It was quiet, except for the sounds of the house itself, the creaking of wood, the distant stir of air. Then, from outside, we heard something. At first we couldn't place it. Later we would learn it was the sheriff speaking to our friends who had gone back early, but in that moment, it was just noise from beyond the walls, filtered through the dark. We prepared to descend the stairs. My friend looked at me and said, "You ready?" I nodded, and we both took a breath, stepping side by side toward the lower floor. But then it happened. A sound, not from outside, but inside. A sharp, audible inhale like someone taking a deep breath only a few feet away. We froze, eyes wide, hearts thudding. I looked at him, he looked at me. The air suddenly felt heavier, as though the house itself had inhaled with us. For a few seconds we didn't move, just stared at one another in silence, the kind of silence that wraps around your spine and squeezes. Then, from below, the girl's voice broke the tension. "What did you say?" she asked. Her tone was confused, unsure. "Are you upstairs?" We didn't respond. We were already moving, hurrying down the steps, drawn not by fear but by a sudden, urgent sense that we were not alone. We exited through the hallway quickly, each of us emerging in turn into the night air where our friends and the police were waiting. The officers didn't question us much, they just asked us not to go back. One even admitted that he believed the building was haunted and said he wouldn't step foot inside, not even for an official call. Later, the girl who had stayed downstairs texted my friend and asked if we could meet up. She said she needed to talk. We assumed it was about the experience and didn't think much of it. She showed up in a sundress. Her usual bright demeanor dimmed. We sat outside a cafe as she explained her version of what happened. At the moment we heard the breath, she had heard a voice, one of us, she thought, say, "What's that?" as if reacting to someone unseen. She hadn't said anything then, but after going home, something strange followed her. She described a nightmare that didn't feel like a dream. She said she awoke in bed that night, unable to move. Her bedroom door creaked open slowly, and in the darkness, she saw a shape, tall, formless, hovering. Then it melted down like water, dissolving into the floor. She tried to scream but couldn't. Her whole body felt paralyzed. Then, as if rising from beneath her bed, a long hand with 3 fingers reached up past her head and gripped her leg hard. She was pulled from her mattress and struck the floor, and that's when she woke up, gasping. As she recounted it to us, she seemed truly shaken, her eyes darting, her hands trembling slightly. I joked, nervously, that maybe she wasn't quite cut out for ghost hunting. But instead of laughing, she slammed her hands on the table, startling the people sitting nearby. I realized then that she was genuinely afraid, not just rattled, but disturbed in a deep and personal way. To calm her down, I told her it was just a dream, that people sometimes carry anxiety from stressful moments into their sleep. But then, she lifted her dress slightly and showed us her leg. There, dark against her skin, were bruises, 3 long finger-shaped marks wrapped around her thigh. My voice caught in my throat. It wasn't just the bruises, it was the look in her eyes. A kind of helpless confusion, as if she wanted an explanation and didn't believe she would get one. And truthfully, we didn't know what to say. We'd both heard the breath. We'd both felt the tension, the weight, the silence that hadn't come from us. Something had been in that house, not just a feeling, but a presence. And maybe it had followed her home. She never came ghost hunting with us again, and I never blamed her. Some things you don't unsee, and some things you don't invite twice. Over the next few weeks, the experience lingered like a fog in my mind. I found myself thinking about that breath, about how deliberate it had sounded. Not just a sound, but a message, a mimicry of us, maybe, or a way to let us know we were being observed. I wondered how many others had felt the same thing in that place. I wondered how long it had been waiting there, watching passers-by from the shadows, unseen and unspoken. The fact that the police wouldn't go in, even when we were inside, only added to the mystery. What had they seen before? What stories did they know but never tell? Maybe it wasn't just an abandoned house. Maybe it was a place that remembered everyone who entered and sometimes reached out just to remind you that it was still alive, in its own way. Years have passed, and I've explored many more places, each with its own echo of history and silence, but that house remains one of the few that truly unsettled me. Not because of what we saw, but because of what we felt and what we didn't see. The breath was real, the bruises were real, the fear in her eyes, the silence from the police. The strange heavy air All of it lingers in my mind like a tune I can't stop humming. I still think about going back one day, not out of bravery but out of a need for closure. Yet something always stops me. A whisper, perhaps, a breath just at the edge of hearing, reminding me that some doors are better left unopened. And maybe that's the truth about these places. They're not just shells of what they once were. They absorb what happens inside them. They echo, not just with footsteps and voices, but with memories, fears, and things we don't have names for. That house didn't need flashing lights or cold spots or floating objects to be terrifying. All it needed was a breath. One sound, perfectly placed, timed with our own. It told us everything we needed to know. We were not alone. We never had been. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. Story 5. The Cork Queen's Factory. It was a structure wrapped in time, a looming monument of stone and steel nestled in the quiet rural heart of Portugal. Once a thriving centre of industry, the Mundet Cork Factory had opened its doors in 1905, breathing life into an era of booming commerce and progress. Generations of workers lived and died by its rhythm. People didn't just work there, they lived there, laughed there, gave birth, and buried the past all within the reach of its brick walls. It was once a symbol of evolution, employing hundreds, especially women, in a time when such independence was rare. But, like all empires, it began to falter. Safety measures were lax, and over time, accidents became whispers that stained the walls. Missing fingers, crushed limbs, and quiet funerals for those whose names were carved into the machines they once manned. In 1950, a medical centre was added nearby to tend to the wounded, but the damage had already been done. And then, tragedy struck harder than ever before. The final blow came in 1986, when the factory's matriarch, Paula Mundet, known throughout the region as the Cork Queen, was murdered in a brutal act by her lover. Her dismembered body was found within the factory's heart, her blood seeping into the very walls that had once been her legacy. Grief consumed the factory as if the building itself mourned her. Her son, Joseph, unable to hold the threads together, closed its doors for good in 1988. From then on, the structure stood silent, a decaying tribute to ambition and loss. In the 90s, it was guarded heavily, though rumours began to spread among the guards themselves. Tales of strange noises, sightings of figures in the vaulted chambers, whispers about a creature they called a werewolf haunting the dark corners. Over time, even the bravest refused to work the night shifts. By the early 2000s, it had become the perfect lure for teens hungry for danger and thrill. Word spread quickly. Some found money. Others stumbled across old equipment, tools, even old firearms. Groups of curious youths came armed with cheap cameras and shaky courage, hoping to catch something paranormal or at least unforgettable. My friends were among them, venturing deeper with each visit. They saw things they didn't understand, distorted faces in reflections, apparitions in the vault area, whispers that crawled along the walls like insects. Still, they returned, over and over. One of them, whom I later befriended, had a collection of these stories like trophies. I listened to him recount them with a strange mix of pride and caution. And then, in 2015, I decided I needed to see it for myself. I had heard too much. I wanted to feel it, to know if the ghosts they spoke of were just fantasy or if the Cork Queen still reigned in death. We entered under a slate-grey sky, through a broken fence behind a construction zone that had stalled mid-development. The air tasted old, like paper and rust. My brother came with us. He'd always been drawn to decay, fascinated by the echoes of forgotten places. The moment we stepped onto the main street of the compound, it felt like walking onto a movie set frozen in time. Cracked windows stared back at us like hollow eyes, and the ground was littered with fragments of history. Our guide, the boy who had explored it countless times, still had a ring of old keys. Some miraculously worked on doors that hadn't been opened in decades. The inside was worse than I imagined. Collapsed beams, warped floors, entire wings of the structure caved in like rotting lungs. But deeper still, we found signs that something persisted, machines covered in dust that looked freshly disturbed, as though someone had brushed them clean. Then came the sound. Mechanical whirring, distant and wrong, like a belt conveyor starting after years of silence. We stopped, frozen. No one moved. My brother raised his camera and snapped a photo. In the display was a thick mist coiling where the sound had come from. We pressed forward cautiously, and the mist followed. Dancing in the corners, clinging to our legs, strange orbs hovered near us, pulsing softly in colours that didn't belong in that space. Purples, greens, reds that flickered like embers. That's when I looked up and saw him. A man, or something like one, watching us from a second-story window. He didn't move, didn't speak. His face obscured in shadow. We ran, breathless, but when we looked again he was gone. And the room he stood in? It had no floor. It was just a void. There was no way anyone could have stood there. We didn't talk much on the way out. Still, something pulled us back. Days later, just my brother and I returned. Armed with better gear, we moved with purpose. We set up sensors in the hallways, watching the readings spike, then vanish. 2 glowing orbs passed right above us, visible to our naked eyes. We didn't scream. We didn't run. We just stood there, overwhelmed. Some places make you feel like a guest. Others make you feel like an intruder. That factory made us feel like prey. On another visit, we ventured into what people called the red zone, the factory's deepest basement. There the roof sagged dangerously, the air was stale, and paper documents from the 1980S lay soggy and torn across rusting desks. Every step echoed as if something beneath the floor waited for us to get close enough to grab. Bats whirled above our heads, water dripped steadily from cracked pipes, and yet we kept going. The group we brought that night was larger, 10 or 12 people, all whispering and clinging to one another. It felt safer in numbers, but the silence swallowed our voices. Even laughter sounded wrong, like it was being mocked. We never made it to the vaults again. Something, perhaps instinct, always made us turn back before we reached it. My friend, the one who'd shown me everything, confessed later that he hadn't returned to the vault since the first time he saw that distorted girl's face in the glass. He had laughed it off then, but it haunted him. He said the more he explored, the more he felt like something inside was learning him, studying him, mimicking. Eventually even he stopped going, and the factory began to fall apart more quickly after that, as though its final breath had been exhaled and the only thing left was for it to collapse into memory. By the time demolition crews arrived, parts of the ceiling had already caved in. A homeless man died one night, crushed beneath crumbling rafters. That was the final sign. They sealed the area, fencing went up, but I went one last time, alone. I stood at the edge of the property, just beyond the no trespassing signs, and listened. There were no machines, no voices, just wind and dust. But for a second, I could have sworn I saw her. Paula Mandé, the Cork Queen, standing in the highest window, her form obscured but unmistakably regal, and I remembered the whispers, the ghost stories, the girls with missing fingers, the warm blood that had soaked into the walls. She hadn't just died there. She had become the place. Now the land is bare, the building is gone. They plan to put up apartments or maybe a shopping centre, but the town has moved on. But sometimes, when I pass by the lot, I wonder what they buried beneath the concrete. Not bones, maybe, but memory, energy, a kind of sadness that isn't finished telling its story. Some say haunted places vanish when the buildings come down. I think it's the opposite. The ghosts scatter like seeds, finding cracks in the world to slip through, and one day, maybe when no one expects it, a new machine will start to hum. A light will flicker on in an empty hallway, and someone will hear her voice again, the Cork Queen, calling out from the dark, reminding us that history isn't silent, it simply waits. Story 6. The Man Behind the Glass. Back when I was in high school in Mesa, Arizona, there was a house that everyone whispered about. It stood at the far end of a neighborhood that had never quite been finished, where paved roads led to empty lots and wild citrus trees grew in quiet defiance of modern planning. At the center of this strange half-developed place was a large, aging mansion. The house loomed like a forgotten relic from another life, its pale stucco exterior cracked with time, its windows always dark. We'd heard rumors of accidents, of a girl who broke her arm there, and about strange noises in the night, but for the most part, it remained just that, a legend, a place we dared each other to visit but rarely did. Until one night, when boredom and curiosity got the better of us, and 6 of us decided to go see it for ourselves. We parked behind the house, well hidden from the street, and made our way through the citrus trees toward the looming structure. The sky above was clear, the air still, and as we drew closer, the rustling of leaves behind us caught our attention. We stopped. I turned and saw them. Pavelinas, wild desert pigs that can be unpredictable. Though they didn't charge us, the sudden encounter was enough to set our nerves on edge, but we pressed on. The house loomed larger as we stepped out of the trees, casting a long, silent shadow across the earth. And that's when we saw it, a light, faint but unmistakably glowing from somewhere inside. We'd never seen the house lit up before, not once in all the times we'd driven by. 4 of the 6 in our group hesitated, nervous now, but 2 of us, emboldened, or maybe just foolish, stepped forward to get a closer look. We moved quietly, approaching the first window. The room beyond was dark, empty, but from the next room over a soft glow poured through the cracks in the door. We stepped to the next window and looked inside. Again, darkness, and yet the light now behind us glowed once more from the room we'd just checked. It was as if it was moving, or we were chasing it. We circled the house, peering into every accessible window, but the source of the light remained elusive, seemed to flicker just out of reach, always in the room we had just left behind. It wasn't flickering like a candle or bulb. It was shifting, purposeful. And that subtle game of light and shadow began to unnerve us in a way we couldn't quite explain. Eventually we regrouped and decided to try the backyard. If nothing else, could sit by the empty pool and tell stories, try to bring the mood back down. The backyard was overgrown but oddly beautiful, lit only by the ambient glow of the moon and stars. We sat near the drained pool, dusted with fallen leaves and sand, and took turns sharing ghost stories. Someone pointed out a large old radio, the kind you'd expect to find in a 1950s living room. It stood silently on the other side of the pool, part of the yard's clutter. I remembered trying to turn it on during a previous visit with a larger group, but it had never worked. It was more of a relic than a threat. But as we sat there wrapped in a story about something else entirely, the radio crackled to life. A sudden burst of static shattered the night air. We all turned, startled. It hissed and whined for a few seconds, and then just as abruptly, fell silent again. 10 seconds, that's all it lasted, but it was long enough to make us feel watched. Something changed after that moment. The stillness we had grown used to became something different, charged, expectant. We rose quietly and began walking through the backyard again, this time moving toward the racquetball court, partially sunken into the ground. There were stairs that led to the roof, about 8 feet off the ground. One of us suggested climbing up to look over the trees, maybe just to feel safe again. We climbed and stood there, looking out across the orange groves, where, in the distance, our car sat like a distant promise of escape. That's when one of my friends froze mid-turn. "Do not turn around," he said. His voice was low, tight with fear. Of course, we all turned. We looked toward the house, squinting at the glass French doors that opened from the first floor to the backyard. There, standing behind the glass, was a man, just a silhouette, tall, unmoving, featureless in the dim glow of the moonlight. He didn't move. He didn't raise a hand or step forward. He just watched us from the other side of the glass. We stood frozen, counting silently, hearts pounding in unison. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then we jumped, all of us, Off the roof, down onto the grass, and we ran through the citrus trees, past the brush, limbs scratching our arms, the scent of torn leaves heavy in the air. We reached the car, piled in without speaking, and sped away into the night, headlights slicing through the dark like knives. It wasn't until we were halfway home that someone finally said what we were all thinking. That silhouette hadn't been there before. That house was supposed to be empty. We never went back to that mansion. It became a boundary in our lives, something we didn't cross again, not physically, not even in conversation. It wasn't just the man behind the glass. It was the feeling that he had been waiting, watching, that we had stumbled into something not meant for us. I often wonder if he would have come out had we not left, or if he ever left that spot, or if he's still there, waiting for the next group of curious souls who think they can chase down shadows without consequence. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I see it in my mind's eye, those doors, that figure, still and silent, like a painting hung in the dark. People always talk about haunted places like they're full of noise, banging doors, screaming spirits, ghostly voices. But what stayed with me was the quiet, that calm, patient presence behind the glass. There was no rush, no threat, just observation. And I think that's what made it so terrifying. It felt like we were part of something larger than ourselves. Something old and slow-moving. Something that doesn't need to chase you because it knows you'll come back eventually, or someone else will. Curiosity is a powerful lure. We didn't disturb that house. We were the ones who were disturbed by what we saw, by what we couldn't explain, and by the strange, silent understanding that some doors open without a sound. And so, the mansion remains a quiet legend in the corner of my memory, a shadow behind the glass that never moves but never truly fades. I never told my parents, never told many others beyond our group. It felt too surreal to share. But the image of that man, his shape carved in darkness, has never left me. Sometimes I dream of him. He's always standing in the same place, always watching but never crossing the glass, and I wake up wondering if maybe the light we saw that night wasn't flickering randomly. Maybe it was a lure, leading us closer. Maybe that house remembers every visitor, and maybe, in some strange way, we left something behind. 2. Story 7. The Line Against the Wall. In the 1980 S, the Lower East Side of New York City wasn't just gritty. It was desperate, raw, and pulsing with danger. Streets were claimed by dealers and the addicted alike, and entire blocks seemed to rot beneath your feet. I was no stranger to it. My friend Mario and I had made runs down those streets more times than I could count, always chasing the next fix, always walking that narrow edge between euphoria and disaster. One night around 9:30, things felt different. The usual spots were shut down. Police presence was heavier than normal, blue lights flashing like warnings in the air. Still, we needed to score. That hunger in your veins doesn't wait for safety. We headed to a place known as The Original, a flattened lot where a building had once stood, now just mounds of rubble and dirt. It was where the real street-level exchanges happened, under the cover of darkness, in places that swallowed screams and left no trace. When we arrived, the air felt thick with tension, more than usual. There were already about 25 people milling around, eyes darting, arms crossed tight, trying to blend in with the debris. The system was always the same. Wait until the tout showed up, then line up when the dealer arrived. But that night, the tout kept coming and going, whispering nervously, looking over his shoulder like he knew something was off. It was as if even the streets were holding their breath. We waited. Minutes dragged. People murmured but didn't leave. And then someone shouted "Bondo," a code word that meant cops were near. The crowd scattered like ants in a flood, but always reassembled within 10 minutes, drawn back by desperation. Eventually, the lot was more crowded than ever. the line curving against a graffiti-scarred wall, like some twisted congregation. Then, without fanfare, a voice ordered, "Line up," and we obeyed. The routine was familiar. The dealer would run along the line, handing off the product as fast as possible, often with an assistant at the other end to collect cash. Sometimes there was an express line if you had extra money, a bribe for faster service. That night was moonless, the street lamps barely functional, casting a sickly yellow glow on the waiting crowd. We stood in silence, faces turned toward the wall, and then I heard it. A sound sharp and unnatural, a gunshot, loud and close. I turned toward the sound just in time to see a man with a chrome-plated pistol raised above his head. He wasn't a dealer. He wasn't even a junkie. He was something else entirely, cold, focused, and terrifying. He fired again and then charged down the debris mound, another man behind him. "Face the wall," he barked, and every one of us did as we were told. They moved quickly, rifling through wallets, checking IDs, collecting cash. I watched as one man argued and got struck across the face with the butt of the pistol. My heart pounded. I wasn't holding the money. Mario was. We had split the roles that night. When the gunman reached me, I told him just that. "My partner's got the cash," I said, voice as steady as I could make it. He looked at me for a moment as if measuring the truth, then raised the gun as if he might strike me, but didn't. Instead, he turned to the next in line. Another shot rang out, this one into the air. "Move!" he screamed. Everyone scattered. I bolted to the right, toward a high mound of garbage and debris. I climbed fast, hands slipping, feet scrambling. Behind me, another shot cracked through the night. The panic was a fire in my lungs. I didn't stop until I was over the top and running down the other side. I didn't know where Mario was. I didn't know if he'd gotten away or if he'd been caught in the chaos. I checked myself for blood. Nothing. Somehow, I hadn't been hit. I walked fast, breathing heavy, ears ringing, down to 3rd Street where another spot waited. They called it Executive. It was a burned-out building, mostly empty except for a few candles flickering on the cracked stairs. We slipped inside, the smell of charred wood and melted plaster thick in the air. A tout nodded and ushered us upstairs. The candles lit our path, like some distorted religious procession, leading the faithful to their fix. On the 3rd floor, the dealer waited. But before the deal could be done, we heard it again. Shouts, footsteps, chaos coming from below. "Bondo!" someone hissed. The dealer vanished into the darkness like a ghost, and that's when I saw it. Something I'd never forget. Junkies, 20 or more, fleeing not down the stairs but through the broken wall to the building next door. A single wooden beam, maybe 14 inches wide, connected the buildings high above the alleyway. In the near darkness they moved like shadows across it, arms outstretched for balance, eyes wide with terror. Mario followed them. I stood frozen, watching him cross the abyss, but I couldn't do it. My legs refused. My fear wasn't the fall. It was the void beneath me. The knowledge that if I took one wrong step, I'd vanish into the dark and no one would find me. I turned and ran deeper into the building, searching for a hiding spot. Every stair creaked like a scream. Every wall echoed with approaching footsteps. Then I found it, an old bathtub filled with hardened plaster and dust. Without thinking, I climbed in and lay down, trying to bury myself, to become invisible. I covered my face, stilled my breath and waited. The police were inside now. I heard their voices, casual, joking even, as they moved floor to floor. I heard someone scream, a heavy thud followed by laughter. Then footsteps came closer. "Well, hello there," a voice said, friendly and cruel at the same time. I froze. I couldn't see them, but they could see me. I braced for the worst. But instead, they told me to get up. Hands shaking, I obeyed. They asked a few questions, checked my ID, and for reasons I still don't understand, let me go. "Get out of here," one of them said. I did. Outside, I found Mario. Somehow he had made it across the beam and out. He still had the money. Later that night he returned with what we'd gone looking for, and though the craving was numbed, something else had been lit inside me. Fear, not just of getting caught, but of what I had seen in that building, of what we all had to become just to survive a single night. I didn't go back to the original. I didn't cross those beams. That line against the wall, the chrome gun, the laughter in the dark, it all became part of a memory I tried to bury but never could. Even now, decades later, I sometimes walk those streets and feel their echoes. The buildings are different, but the shadows remain. The lot where the original once stood is now paved over, turned into a community garden or a parking lot. But when the wind is just right, when night settles in and the air grows still, I can still feel it. The line, the silence, the sound of a pistol cocking. The ghosts of the addicted still walk those blocks, not as spirits, but as memories etched into the concrete. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you'll hear them breathing behind you, soft, desperate, and waiting. Story 8. Shadows of Bodmin Jail. I was 16 the first time I set foot in Bodmin Jail. It was a family trip, just a short stop during a holiday in Cornwall, the kind you forget about until years later when something triggers a memory. I'd seen pictures of the place online, walls draped in ivy, crumbling bricks glowing in the slant of late afternoon sun. It looked like the kind of place you visited to take moody photographs, to imagine the past behind every shuttered window. I didn't believe in ghosts back then. I was curious, maybe even hopeful. But belief was something I hadn't earned yet. I collected books on the paranormal, watched all the usual ghost shows, but until that visit, I had never experienced anything that left a mark on me. Not in the real world, not in daylight. But that would soon change. Bodmin had a way of crawling beneath your skin when you weren't paying attention. As we passed through the main gates, a chill settled over me. Not the kind that comes from wind or shade, but something internal, like your body realizing it's in a place that doesn't forget. We descended a narrow stairwell into the basement, the cold air sharpening into something nearly tangible, and that's when it hit me. A wave of sensation, overwhelming and immediate. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was grief, rage, hopelessness, despair, all layered and indistinct like overwhelming voices. I stopped, gripped the railing and tried to breathe. Everything felt wrong. The walls pulsed with memory, the floor hummed with silence, and I felt like I had walked into a dream where the air itself judged you. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. It was as though I had entered not a room, but a moment, trapped in time, playing endlessly on repeat, waiting for someone to notice. The rest of the tour passed in a fog. I followed my family from room to room, but I wasn't really there. I remember small things, the scratch of old iron bars, the dust on forgotten windowsills, the sudden cold of a shadowed corridor. There was a part of the jail, near the naval wing, that felt almost alive. I didn't know what had happened there, but I knew it hadn't been kind. A shaft or chimney loomed in one corner, a vertical tunnel swallowed by blackness, and I remember the sensation it gave me, like standing too close to the edge of a secret. Oddly, the execution pit didn't affect me much. I stood above it, waiting for a reaction that never came. It was just a space. But the basement? That was something else entirely. It clung to me, whispered into the quiet places in my mind, and followed me out. After that trip, life continued. I began college, and on the surface everything was fine, but soon, without warning, I started to unravel. The panic attacks came first. Sudden waves of anxiety that hit me in classrooms, buses, close spaces. Then came the dreams. Not nightmares, but something stranger. I would wake feeling hollow, like I had just lived someone else's memories. Grief that wasn't mine, fear that didn't belong to me. I couldn't explain it. My therapist later suggested PTSD, noting that my symptoms mirrored those of people who had been incarcerated or trapped. I'd never experienced anything remotely like that, but still, something inside me felt caged. My mind would drift back to the basement at Bodmin, to the silence that had screamed without sound. I began to wonder if I had truly left that place, or if a part of it had come back with me. Years passed. I recovered, mostly. Meditation helped, spirituality helped, but the feeling never fully left. One day, on a whim, I tried a guided meditation exercise meant to uncover past life memories. I didn't expect much, but during the session, images came, vivid, strange, and haunting. One stood out: a tall clock tower, his face cracked, hands frozen in place. After the meditation, I drew it, and hours later, while scrolling online, I found a picture of that very tower. It stood not far from Bodmin Jail. Something clicked inside me. That wasn't a coincidence. That was memory. Maybe not mine, or maybe not from this life, but something. That was when it all flooded back. The sensations, the smells, the quiet weight pressing on my chest as I descended into that building's soul. I hadn't just visited Bodmin Jail. I had awakened something there, or it had awakened something in me. I began to research more, digging into the jail's history, trying to match the feelings I'd had with documented events. I found records of abuse, of hidden punishments, of deaths buried in paperwork, but it wasn't the facts I sought, it was confirmation. I needed to know I wasn't alone in feeling what I did. On forums and Reddit threads, I found others who had walked those halls and come away changed. Some reported attachments, others dreams. One woman claimed she had felt someone touch her shoulder in the basement, only to turn and find the room empty. Another described crying uncontrollably near the naval wing, despite having no idea why. That validation was both comforting and disturbing. Something lived there still, and it didn't need to be seen to leave a mark. What I felt at Bodmin wasn't evil. It wasn't malevolent. It was sorrow. Deep, endless sorrow. The kind that settles into stone and never quite fades. I've often wondered if the jail holds not just the memory of its prisoners, but the energy of injustice itself. A place can soak in pain like water, and when enough time passes, when enough people suffer within the same walls, something changes. That sorrow learns to speak, not in words, but in pressure, in stillness, in the way your heart skips a beat as you cross a certain threshold. That's what I felt. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but history itself, alive and whispering in my ear. Sometimes I wonder if I've imagined it all, if the trauma I experienced in the years after was just the result of stress, of school, of growing up. But then I remember how it felt, how real it was. I remember the breath catching in my throat, the way the light dimmed even when the windows were clear. The sensation of being watched, not by eyes, but by time itself. And I know the truth. Bodmin changed me. Whether it was a past life or an emotional resonance I picked up on, I can't say. But I do know that I never left empty-handed. Part of that place came home with me. And now, even on my best days, there are moments, sudden, unexpected, when I feel it again. A twinge in my chest, a shiver along my spine. I'll be laughing, or walking, or just existing, and then I'm back there, back in the basement, back in the dark, feeling not just fear, but an unbearable ache, like someone crying silently behind a wall. And just as suddenly, it's gone. A whisper fading into silence, but I never forget. Not anymore. If you've ever been to Bodmin Jail and felt something you couldn't name, know this: you're not alone. Some places don't just remember, they reach back, they follow, and sometimes they remind you that you were never just a visitor, you were a witness